By sunrise, Alpha King Alexander Whitmore had learned that a kingdom could lose its breath without making a sound. It began with small failures. The northern gate remained sealed when the merchant envoys arrived, leaving 6 loaded wagons waiting outside in the frost. The eastern ambassador was led to the wrong receiving hall and left standing beneath cold chandeliers for nearly an hour. 3 council elders argued over a border map. None of them could read properly because the latest markings had not been transferred to the public copy. In the military wing, Captain Mason Reed discovered that no one knew where the winter ration orders had been placed. No one except Grace Miller. And Grace Miller was gone. Alexander did not believe it at first. He stood in the center of her chambers while morning light spilled across the polished floor, holding the Luna necklace she had left behind on the writing desk. Silver chain, moonstone pendant, the symbol he had allowed her to wear in private, but never fully honored before the kingdom. It lay cold against his palm now, lighter than it should have been. Too light for something that had just shattered the order of his entire palace. Her room was too clean. That was what unsettled him first. Not destroyed, not careless, not packed in panic. Clean, deliberate. The bed had not been slept in. The wardrobe doors stood open, revealing empty spaces where only practical clothes had been taken. Her ceremonial gowns remained. His gifts remained. The pearl comb he had bought after the Western Treaty remained untouched beside the mirror. Even the lavender ribbons she used to tie council files were stacked neatly in the drawer. Grace had not fled like a frightened woman. She had removed herself like a decision. Alexander turned slowly, searching for some sign of anger. A broken vase, a torn letter, a note written in tears. Anything that would let him call this temporary. Anything that would let him say she wanted to be found. There was nothing. On the desk, beside the necklace, sat the completed reports he had sent for the night before. Border taxes, grain transfers, guard rotations, southern pact disputes. Every page finished. Every seal correct. Every problem solved before she vanished from the palace that had mistaken her silence for obedience. Mason stood near the doorway, face pale, helmet tucked beneath one arm. "Your Majesty," he said carefully. "The servants say she was last seen before dawn." Alexander closed his hand around the necklace. "Seen where?" Mason hesitated. That hesitation sharpened something dangerous inside the room. The lower west passage. Silence. Alexander knew that passage. Old servants' route. Narrow. Unwatched. It led beyond the inner walls, past the garden stores, and out near the stone bridge before the main gates opened. Grace had known exactly which path would cost him the most time. His wolf stirred under his skin, not roaring yet. Listening. Searching. Finding only the fading edge of her scent where warmth used to be. She left no message? Alexander asked. Mason's jaw tightened. "No, my king. No message. No goodbye. No accusation. Just absence." Somehow, that cut deeper than blame. Alexander looked again at the room. At the necklace. At the documents. At the untouched gifts. For years, Grace had stood inside his life so quietly that he had confused her presence with permanence. She answered before being summoned, fixed mistakes before they reached him, waited through long councils, colder dinners, public distance, private almost kindness. He had thought patience meant she would stay. He had thought loyalty meant she had nowhere else to go. Outside the chamber, footsteps rushed through the hall. Another servant. Another failure. Another piece of the kingdom realizing too late that Grace Miller had been holding it together with invisible hands. Alexander's voice came out low. "Close every gate." Mason lifted his head. "Your Majesty?" "Search the roads. The river crossing. The western bridge. Every inn before the neutral lands." His grip tightened until the moonstone pendant pressed into his skin. "Find her." Mason bowed and left quickly. Alexander remained in the empty room as the palace woke into panic around him. By sunrise, he had turned the kingdom upside down searching. But Grace had not disappeared because she was lost. She had left because, sometime before dawn, she finally understood she did not need to be found by the man who had never truly seen her. The night before the kingdom began falling apart, Grace Miller was still doing what everyone expected her to do. She walked alone through the western corridor of Whitmore Palace, carrying a stack of sealed reports against her chest while the royal banquet continued 3 floors below. Music rose through the marble halls in distant waves. Laughter followed it. Warm. Careless. Easy. Grace moved through the colder part of the palace, where the candles burned lower and the guards stopped speaking when she passed, because they never knew whether to bow to her as Luna or ignore her, as Alexander often did in public. She had stopped correcting them years ago. Correction required certainty. Alexander had never given her enough of that. The reports in her arms were heavier than they looked. Border taxes, winter ration requests, a dispute between two Southern Pack families that would become bloodshed if the wording was not softened before morning. Grace had finished them after dinner while the rest of the palace celebrated the arrival of Vanessa Clark, the noblewoman everyone pretended was only an old political ally. Grace had watched Vanessa smile beside Alexander at the banquet table. She had watched Alexander lean down when Vanessa spoke, giving her the kind of public attention Grace had learned not to expect. Not a touch. Not a promise. Nothing obvious enough to accuse. That was always the worst part. The wounds Alexander gave her were rarely sharp enough for witnesses to name. They were small, repeated, polished into manners. He did not insult her before the court. He simply failed to introduce her. He did not deny her place. He simply never confirmed it. He did not tell her to wait forever. He only gave her just enough warmth in private to make leaving feel dramatic and staying feel reasonable. Grace reached the turn before the council wing and slowed. An hour earlier, he had come to her study himself. That alone had surprised her. Alexander Whitmore rarely came to anyone. People came to him, but he had stood in her doorway while she checked the grain ledgers, his black formal coat open at the collar, his expression tired in a way that still had the power to soften her. "You are the only one I trust with this kingdom," he had said, quietly, almost tenderly. Grace had looked up at him, and foolishly, terribly, some old part of her had warmed. Not because it was love. She knew better now. But because starvation could make even crumbs feel like mercy. He had stepped closer then, adjusted the moonstone pendant at her throat, and let his fingers rest near her collarbone for one heartbeat too long. "Bring the border reports to the council chamber before midnight," he said. "They will listen if the seals come from you." There it was. The request hidden inside softness. The duty dressed in intimacy. Grace had nodded anyway. She always did. Now, walking toward the council chamber with the reports completed and tied in lavender ribbon, she wondered when exactly she had become a woman who could recognize disappointment before it arrived. The corridor ahead glowed beneath two bronze lamps. Beyond the carved oak doors, men were speaking. Alexander's voice among them. Calm, certain, a king's voice. Grace adjusted the reports in her arms and prepared to enter. She did not know that within the next few minutes, the last fragile thread holding her to Whitmore Palace would finally snap. She only knew she was tired. Not sleepy, not weak. Tired in the soul-deep way of someone who had spent years being useful and mistaking that for being loved. Grace reached the council chamber doors with her hand already lifting toward the brass handle. Then she heard her name. Not loudly, not sharply, casually. That was what made her stop. Inside the chamber, someone laughed beneath his breath, the sound softened by oak and distance. "Lady Grace handled the southern dispute again?" a councilman asked. "Of course she did," another replied. "She handles everything no one wants to touch." More laughter followed. Grace stood very still. The reports remained pressed against her chest, the lavender ribbon smooth beneath her fingers. She should have entered. She had every reason to enter. The documents were expected. The seals were correct. The council was waiting for her work, if not for her. But then Alexander spoke, and the corridor seemed to narrow around the sound of his voice. "Grace is reliable." A pause. A glass touched wood inside the room. That is her best quality. Her best quality. Not her wisdom. Not her loyalty. Not her years beside him. Reliable. Like a locked gate. Like a sharpened blade. Like a candle always lit in a room no one thanked for being bright. Grace lowered her hand from the door. Another councilman chuckled. Reliable women often become dangerous when they realize they are being used. The words should have warned Alexander. They should have made him careful. Instead, his answer came smooth and untroubled. "Grace will not leave." Silence touched the corridor first. Then the sentence finished killing something inside her. Not because it was unexpected, because it was familiar, because some part of her had known he believed it. "She understands loyalty better than pride," Alexander continued. "She knows her place in this kingdom." The reports shifted slightly in Grace's arms. Her fingers tightened once. Only once. She did not cry. The body had strange mercies. Sometimes it closed the door before grief could enter. Inside the chamber, Elder Voss gave a thoughtful hum. Still, Your Majesty, she has managed more of the palace than most of the council. If she chose to withdraw her support, the transition would be inconvenient. Inconvenient, another man echoed, amused. Alexander's voice cooled with confidence. She will not withdraw anything. A chair creaked. Someone moved closer to the table. And if she asks for public recognition? The court has begun to notice how often she carries Luna duties without the Luna title. Grace's breath slowed. There. The question she had never dared ask aloud, finally placed before him by someone else. For one foolish heartbeat, she waited. Not for a declaration. She was no longer that young. Not for romance. Not for a crown. Only for respect. A simple correction would have been enough. Grace has earned her place. Grace is not to be spoken of as a tool. Grace matters. Alexander gave her none of those things. Grace does not ask for more, he said. That is why she works. The room laughed. Not cruelly, perhaps. Not all of them. Some laughed because powerful men had laughed first, and weak men loved surviving by echo. But it did not matter. The laughter reached her anyway. It slipped under the door, crossed the polished floor, and settled inside her chest with astonishing quiet. That was the moment Grace understood. The tenderness in her study had not been tenderness. The hand at her throat, the softened voice, the confession that he trusted only her with the kingdom. It had been true, perhaps. That was the worst part. He did trust her. He trusted her to carry what he did not want to hold. He trusted her to endure what he refused to name. He trusted her to stay useful, silent, and grateful for private crumbs while he starved her publicly. Her pain did not arrive as thunder. It arrived as clarity. Complete. Immediate. Cold enough to steady her. Grace looked down at the reports in her arms. Every page finished. Every mistake corrected. Every crisis softened before it could reach his throne. She had spent years protecting a kingdom that would not protect her dignity. Inside, Alexander continued speaking. Send for her if the Eastern ambassador asks for numbers. She remembers the accounts better than the clerks. Of course. Send for her. Use her memory. Use her patience. Use her silence. Grace stepped back from the door. One step, then another. The corridor behind her waited, long and dim beneath the bronze lamps. No one had seen her. No one knew she had heard. That seemed fitting. So much of her life in Whitmore Palace had happened unnoticed. She turned away without delivering the reports, then paused. Slowly, she placed them on the narrow marble table beside the council entrance, perfectly aligned, seals facing upward. Let them have the work, not the woman. Then Grace Miller walked back down the western corridor alone, already knowing that before sunrise, Alpha King Alexander Whitmore would learn the difference between a woman who was loyal and a woman who had finally had enough. Grace did not remember walking away from the council chamber. She remembered the sound of her own footsteps. Soft, even, unhurried. That was all. The corridor seemed longer than before, as if the palace had stretched itself into something unfamiliar the moment she stopped belonging to it. Music still drifted from the banquet floors below. Somewhere, Vanessa Clark was probably smiling beneath golden chandeliers while nobles leaned close to catch every word she said. Somewhere, Alexander Whitmore sat in his council chamber, speaking of Grace as if she were a quiet mechanism built into the walls. Useful, reliable, predictable. She almost stopped at the word predictable, not because it hurt more than the others, because it was true. She had been predictable, painfully so. He could predict that she would finish the reports, predict that she would soften his political mistakes, predict that she would stand in the background while he gave warmth to other women in public and fragments of gentleness to her in private. Predict that one softened sentence, one touch at her throat, one tired look from him would keep her from asking for the dignity she deserved. Grace reached the first staircase and placed one hand on the cold banister. Her fingers were steady. That surprised her. She had imagined, in the foolish years when she still thought heartbreak came like storms, that the end would be dramatic. A shouted argument. A broken glass. A door slammed hard enough to wake the palace. Perhaps tears. Perhaps a confession pulled from him too late. But there was nothing dramatic inside her now. No fire. No trembling. No need to make him understand. Something worse had happened. She understood. The truth did not break her open. It closed something. Quietly. Completely. She descended the stairs toward the eastern wing, passing portraits of former Lunas whose painted eyes followed her through the dim light. Women crowned properly, named properly, remembered properly. Grace had spent years walking beneath their faces wearing a moonstone necklace instead of a crown, a private promise instead of a public place. Alexander had told her timing was delicate. The council was divided. The kingdom needed stability first. Later, he had said, after the Northern Treaty, after the winter unrest, after Vanessa's family withdrew their claim, after one more season, one more crisis, one more reason for Grace to wait beautifully while he decided whether she was worth choosing aloud. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused beside a tall window. Rain had begun. Thin silver lines cut down the glass, blurring the garden beyond. Her reflection stared back at her. Pale face, soft curves wrapped in a dark blue evening dress. Moonstone pendant resting at her throat like a question that had finally received its answer. Grace lifted her hand to it. The chain was warm from her skin. Alexander had fastened it there 2 years ago in his private study. No witnesses, no announcement, just his hands, his quiet voice, and her heart desperate enough to turn secrecy into romance. Wear this, he had said, until I can give you everything else. Grace looked at the woman in the glass and almost felt sorry for her. Not with shame, with tenderness. She had not been stupid. She had been hungry. Hungry for certainty. Hungry for respect. Hungry for one public moment that proved she had not invented the meaning of every private touch. The pendant slipped between her fingers. Small, beautiful, insufficient. Footsteps sounded somewhere above. Male voices leaving the council wing. Grace lowered her hand and continued walking. Not faster. She refused to let fear enter a decision that clarity had made. Near the eastern corridor, a young maid stopped with a basket of folded linens. My lady. Grace turned. The girl's eyes moved to her empty hands. Did the council not need the reports? For a moment, Grace nearly answered as she always had. Something gentle, something harmless, something that protected everyone else from discomfort. Instead, she said, they have what they need. The maid blinked, unsure why the words sounded final. Grace gave her a small nod and walked on. Behind her, the palace continued breathing in its old rhythm, unaware that the rhythm had already failed. She reached her chamber doors and entered without lighting the lamps. Darkness met her softly. Familiar furniture, folded gowns, shelves of ledgers, a room filled with years of waiting. Grace closed the door behind her and stood very still. Then, for the first time all night, she allowed herself one quiet breath that belonged only to her. Not to the kingdom, not to the throne, not to Alexander. To her. By the time that breath left her, Grace Miller had stopped wondering whether he would ever choose her. She had finally chosen to leave. Grace lit only one candle. Not the silver lamps along the wall. Not the chandelier Alexander had ordered installed after the northern delegation complained her chambers looked too modest for someone so close to the throne. One candle beside the writing desk. Small. Quiet. Enough. The flame rose slowly, then steadied, casting soft gold across the room that had held too many versions of her. Grace the patient. Grace the useful. Grace the woman who waited at windows long after banquets ended because Alexander sometimes came to her after everyone else had left. Sometimes. That word had ruined years of her life. Sometimes he was gentle. Sometimes he remembered she liked tea without honey. Sometimes his hand lingered against her lower back as he passed behind her chair. Sometimes his voice softened when no one important was there to hear it. And because of those sometimes, she had forgiven the always. Always hidden. Always waiting. Always unnamed. Grace crossed to the wardrobe and opened it. The ceremonial gowns hung untouched in careful rows. Silver. Blue. Ivory. Dresses chosen for a woman allowed to appear beside power but never stand inside it. She did not take them. They belonged to rooms like this. To court dinners where she smiled politely while nobles wondered whether she was almost Luna or merely convenient. Her hand moved past velvet sleeves and pearl-threaded hems until she reached the plain travel dress folded at the back. Dark gray wool. Practical. Warm. Hers. She laid it on the bed. Then came a cloak, thick stockings, a small pouch of coins, 3 identification papers, and the old silver knife her father had given her before he died. Not ornamental. Not royal. Useful in the way survival was useful, not the way Alexander meant it. She changed without hurry. The blue evening dress fell to the floor in a soft circle around her feet. For a moment, Grace looked at it, then stepped out. No mourning, no ceremony. The woman who had worn that dress to the banquet was already gone. At the desk, she gathered the final ledgers and stacked them neatly. She had completed the winter ration schedule 2 nights early. The Eastern trade numbers were marked in red. The Southern dispute letters were sealed and ready for delivery. Even now, some exhausted part of her had left the kingdom better than it deserved. That almost made her laugh. Almost. She took a blank sheet of paper from the drawer. Her hand hovered above it. A letter would be easy. A final explanation. A sentence sharp enough to make him bleed. You call me useful. You were right. Watch what happens when I stop being useful to you. The thought came cleanly, cruelly, then passed. Grace set the paper down untouched. No. If Alexander wanted reasons, he could remember his own words. She would not translate her pain for the man who had spoken it fluently behind closed doors. A knock sounded softly. Grace went still. "My lady," the maid from the corridor whispered. "Are you awake?" Grace crossed to the door and opened it halfway. The girl stood outside with nervous eyes and empty hands. Too young to hide concern properly. "I saw you come back alone," she said. "I thought you might need help." Grace looked at her for a long second. Kindness still hurt, especially when it came from people with no power to offer anything else. "What is your name?" Grace asked. The maid blinked. "Elsie, my lady." "Elsie," Grace said gently. "Do you know the lower west passage?" The girl's face paled. That was answer enough. "My lady, I am not asking you to lie for me." Grace's voice stayed calm. "I am asking whether the passage is still unguarded before dawn." Elsie swallowed. "Until the first bell. The kitchen boys use it after that." Grace nodded. "Thank you." Tears gathered in Elsie's eyes. "Should I tell His Majesty?" Grace almost smiled, but it did not reach warmth. "He is occupied." The girl looked down. She understood more than Grace had said. Most women in palaces did. Grace stepped back from the door. "Forget you saw me tonight." Elsie's voice broke slightly. "Are you coming back?" Silence settled between them. Gentle. Final. Grace looked once over her shoulder at the room. The gowns, the ledgers, the candle, the life that had asked her to become smaller so it could remain comfortable. Then she touched the moonstone pendant at her throat. "No," she said. "I do not think I am." Elsie covered her mouth with one hand. Grace closed the door softly before sympathy could become another chain. Alone again, she faced the mirror. The moonstone necklace glowed faintly against her skin. Beautiful. Private. Insufficient. Slowly, she unclasped it. The chain slid free like a breath she had been holding for 2 years. Grace placed it on the writing desk beside the completed reports. No note beneath it. No explanation. Just the necklace, cold and visible in the candlelight. Then she lifted her travel bag, extinguished the flame, and let darkness take the room before she left it. Grace reached the lower west passage just as the first edge of dawn began thinning the darkness outside the palace walls. The corridor was narrow, built for servants, not royalty. No portraits watched from the stone. No silver banners hung overhead. No ceremonial wolves guarded the corners with carved mouths and polished eyes. Only damp walls, old lantern hooks, and a draft that smelled of rain, ashes, and the world beyond Whitmore Palace. Grace preferred it immediately. Her travel bag rested against her hip. The gray cloak hid most of her dress. Her hair, no longer pinned for court, fell loosely around her face. Without the moonstone necklace at her throat, she felt strangely bare. Not incomplete. Free. She had almost reached the small iron door at the end of the passage when a voice came from behind her. "Grace." She stopped. Not because he commanded it. Because some endings deserved to be faced once. Slowly, she turned. Alpha King Alexander Whitmore stood at the mouth of the passage, still dressed in black council clothes, his coat open at the collar, his dark hair slightly disordered as if he had come too quickly to pretend calm. In his hand, he held nothing. That was good. No necklace. No documents. No beautiful symbol to soften what he had done. Just him. Just the man behind the throne. His gaze moved over her cloak, the travel bag, the plain dress beneath. For the first time in years, Alexander looked at Grace as if he did not know where to place her. "Where are you going?" he asked. Grace's voice was even. "Away." His jaw tightened. "At this hour?" "Before this hour, preferably." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Familiar. Safe for him. Anger was easier than fear. You are upset, he said. Whatever you heard, we can discuss it tomorrow. Grace looked at him quietly. There it was. Tomorrow. The word he had used for years without always saying it. Tomorrow he would name her properly. Tomorrow he would explain Vanessa. Tomorrow the council would understand. Tomorrow the kingdom would be ready. Tomorrow, later, after, soon. A lifetime built from postponement. There will be no tomorrow for this, she said. Alexander went still. The draft moved between them, lifting the edge of her cloak. Somewhere far above, the banquet music had faded into the exhausted silence before morning. Grace, he said more carefully, do not turn one conversation into a decision you cannot take back. She almost smiled. Not with humor, with recognition. He still believed the conversation was the wound. He did not understand that the conversation had only shown her the shape of the wound she had been living inside. One conversation, she repeated softly. Is that what you think this is? His expression sharpened. I did not mean for you to hear it that way. No, she said. You did not mean for me to hear it at all. Silence struck the passage. Alexander looked away first. Only for a second. Long enough. Grace adjusted the strap of her bag. You call me useful because I never asked for more. His eyes returned to hers. You are useful. That was not an insult. The answer was so immediate, so honest in its blindness, that it finished something inside her with almost merciful precision. Grace nodded once. I know. That unsettled him more than anger would have. He stepped closer. You know? Yes. I know you meant it. Alexander stopped. His wolf stirred behind his eyes, silver and restless. I trust you more than anyone in this palace. You trust my labor, Grace said. Not my heart. His mouth tightened. That is unfair. No, she replied. It is accurate. Another silence. He looked past her then, toward the iron door, toward the road beyond, toward a world where his authority thinned with every mile. You cannot simply leave. Grace tilted her head slightly. Watch me. The words were quiet. No threat. No drama. Just truth. Alexander moved before thinking, reaching for her wrist the way he had done 100 times in dim rooms, after councils, before departures, whenever he wanted her still without asking her to stay. Grace stepped back. His hand closed on air. For the first time, the space between them obeyed her instead of him. Alexander stared at his empty hand. Grace said, Do not touch me because you are afraid of what happens when I am gone. His voice dropped. And what happens when you are gone? Grace looked at him for one long second. The king. The man. The almost love she had mistaken for enough. Then she turned toward the iron door. You will find out by sunrise. She opened it. Cold air rushed in. No guards waited outside. No carriage. No grand escape. Only the narrow path beyond the servants' wall, wet stones, pale dawn, and freedom quiet enough not to announce itself. Alexander said her name once more. This time, it sounded less like command and more like something breaking. Grace did not look back. She stepped through the door and pulled it closed behind her, leaving Alpha King Alexander Whitmore alone in the passage with the first morning light and the last thing she would ever give him. Absence. By the time the iron door shut between them, Alexander Whitmore had already decided Grace would come back. Not because she had said so. Not because anything in her face had softened before she left. Because the alternative was too large to understand in a narrow servant's passage before dawn. Grace Miller did not leave him. Grace Miller corrected him, waited for him, went silent when hurt, then appeared later with finished reports and tired eyes. Grace Miller endured. That was the shape he had given her in his mind, and for a few stunned seconds, he clung to it like law. Outside the door, her footsteps faded along the wet stone path. Alexander stood still, listening until even his wolf could no longer separate her steps from the rain. The silence afterward was wrong. Too open. Too final. His hand remained half-raised where she had refused his touch. Empty air pressed against his palm. He closed his fingers slowly. Nothing. A muscle worked in his jaw. This was anger, he told himself. Her anger. Temporary. She had heard something she should not have heard. Misunderstood what he had meant. Taken counsel words too personally. By breakfast, she would calm down. By noon, she would realize she had nowhere safer than the palace. By nightfall, he would send Mason to escort her back with dignity. Not force. Dignity. The lie sounded almost reasonable until he turned back toward the corridor and saw how small the passage looked without her in it. Alexander walked back into the palace. The servants' halls were waking. Kitchen boys carried flour sacks. A maid hurried past with folded linens and froze when she saw him. Her face went pale so quickly his eyes narrowed. "You," he said. The girl bowed too deeply. "Your Majesty, did you see Lady Grace?" The maid's hands tightened around the linens. "No, Your Majesty." Too fast. Too frightened. Alexander stepped closer. "Your name?" "Elsie, my king." "Elsie." He recognized the name vaguely. One of the Eastern Wing maids. Grace knew every servant by name. Remembered whose mother was ill, whose brother needed work, whose wages had been shorted by careless stewards. Alexander knew this because the palace ran smoothly, not because he had asked why. "If she returns," he said, "inform me immediately." Elsie swallowed. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Returns." The word landed strangely after he said it. He moved past her before she could see his expression change. The council chamber doors were open when he reached the western wing. Inside, two elders argued over the reports Grace had left on the marble table. One held the Southern dispute file upside down. Another complained that the border tax notes were coded in Grace's private shorthand, and no clerk could interpret them before the Eastern ambassador arrived. Alexander stopped outside the chamber. No one noticed him at first. That, too, was unusual. Grace always noticed before anyone else. She would lift her eyes, read the room, and adjust the conversation before tension became visible. Without her, even the air felt poorly managed. "Find Lady Grace." Elder Voss snapped at a servant. "She will know where the corrected figures are." Alexander entered. Every man went silent. The servant bowed so quickly the papers nearly slipped from his hands. Elder Voss straightened. "Your Majesty, we were just preparing the morning brief." Alexander's gaze moved to the table. Grace's reports lay aligned, sealed, perfect. Work completed. Woman absent. "Use what she left," he said. Elder Voss hesitated. "Some of the references require clarification." Alexander's voice cooled. "Then clarify them." No one answered. Because they could not. The first crack appeared there, not in his heart, not yet, but in the machinery of the kingdom. A kingdom he had believed obeyed him because he was powerful. A kingdom that, in truth, had often obeyed because Grace had quietly translated his power into order. Alexander left before the elders could ask another question. His steps took him east without permission from his pride. Grace's chamber doors stood closed when he reached them. He opened them expecting warmth, perhaps candlelight, perhaps proof that she had returned through some other passage just to make him feel foolish. Darkness waited. The room smelled faintly of extinguished wax and lavender. On the writing desk, beside a stack of completed ledgers, lay the moonstone necklace. Alexander stared at it. Grace had not forgotten it. She had removed it. Deliberately. Carefully. Like a chain she had finally decided was not worth its beauty. He picked it up. The pendant was cold. His wolf went still. Not calm. Listening to the absence beneath the silence. Downstairs, someone shouted that the northern gate had not been opened for the merchant invoice. Another voice answered that only Lady Grace knew which seal authorized early entry. Alexander closed his fist around the necklace. For the first time since the iron door shut, the lie began to fail. Grace was not waiting somewhere for him to find the right words. Grace was gone, and the palace had already started proving she had been holding more than his patience together. By noon, Whitmore Palace was no longer pretending Grace Miller's absence was temporary. It was failing too loudly for pride to cover. The Eastern ambassador left the wrong receiving hall furious after waiting beneath cold chandeliers for 2 hours without tea, documents, or formal greeting. The northern merchants refused to unload their grain wagons because the early entry seal Grace normally prepared had not been issued. 2 minor pack leaders arrived for arbitration and nearly began fighting in the lower courtyard when no one could find the peace terms Grace had drafted the week before. In the military wing, Captain Mason Reed stood over 3 maps, jaw tight, while 4 officers argued about patrol routes already corrected in Grace's handwriting but not understood by anyone else. "Where is the Western Bridge report?" one officer demanded. Lady Grace kept the updated copy, another muttered. "Then find her." The room went silent when Alexander entered. He did not ask why they needed her. That question had begun to feel dangerous. Instead, he looked at Mason. "Report." Mason's expression was careful in the way loyal men became careful when truth had no safe shape. The Northern Gate delay cost us 2 merchant agreements. The Eastern ambassador is demanding a private apology. The Southern families refuse arbitration without Lady Grace present because she was the only one both sides trusted. Alexander's hand tightened around the moonstone necklace in his pocket. He had not meant to bring it with him. Yet somehow, when he left her chambers, it came too. Cold, silent, accusing. They will accept royal judgment, he said. Mason hesitated. They accepted royal judgment because she made it sound fair. No one breathed. Alexander turned slowly. Mason did not lower his eyes. That was new. Or perhaps not new. Perhaps Grace had simply always stood between Alexander and the truths people were too afraid to say directly. Careful, Alexander said. Mason's face tightened. Yes, Your Majesty. But the damage was done. The sentence stayed in the room after the man stopped speaking. Because she made it sound fair. Alexander looked down at the maps. Red marks. Blue marks. Thin black lines marking roads, bridges, winter stores, patrol gaps. Grace's notes covered the margins in small, precise handwriting. Move grain before frost. Delay tax until river opens. Do not assign Keller Patrol to Southern Road. Blood feud risk. Check bridge support before merchant convoy. Details. Hundreds of them. Quiet safeguards hidden inside ink. He had signed the final orders every season and believed the kingdom functioned because his name carried authority. Now he saw her handwriting beneath that authority like bones beneath skin. Vanessa Clark appeared near the doorway shortly after, dressed in pale rose, her expression arranged into concern. Alexander, she said softly. The council is saying Grace abandoned her duties. The word abandon moved through the room wrong. Mason's eyes sharpened, but he said nothing. Alexander looked at Vanessa. She had been admired at last night's banquet. Beautiful, polished, easy with compliments. The nobles had leaned toward her because she knew how to shine where Grace had known how to hold things together. Did she? Alexander asked. Vanessa blinked. What? Did she abandon her duties? Vanessa's lips parted, uncertain. She left. Alexander reached for the nearest file and opened it. Grace's seal rested at the bottom of every completed page. Every duty finished before dawn. Every crisis marked. Every instruction left behind for people who had never bothered to learn the work because Grace had always done it first. No, he said quietly. She completed them. Silence folded over the room. Vanessa's face changed, just slightly. Irritation beneath softness. Then why is everyone panicking? Alexander looked at the maps again. At the notes. At the kingdom unraveling not because Grace had failed it, but because she had finally stopped cushioning its failures. Because we do not know how to read what she left us. By late afternoon, the palace had turned into a living confession. Servants knocked on Grace's empty door by habit. Clerks carried ledgers to her study before remembering no one waited inside. Elders asked for her twice, then stopped saying her name when Alexander's expression darkened. But stopping did not erase the need. It only made the silence louder. At sunset, Mason returned from the western search line, rain on his cloak and mud on his boots. Alexander was in Grace's study, standing over her desk, reading a ration note he should have understood years ago. Mason paused at the threshold. Your Majesty. Alexander did not turn. You found something. It was not a question. Mason stepped inside. A stable boy saw a woman matching Lady Grace's description cross the old stone bridge before first light. Alexander's wolf lifted its head. Finally. Which direction? Mason's answer came carefully. West. Alexander turned then. Toward the neutral towns? Mason shook his head. Farther north of them. The room seemed to still before the words finished. Toward the Miller lands. Grace's father's territory. Old. Independent. Protected by treaty. A place Alexander could not enter as king without invitation. A place Grace could reach if she had planned well enough. Of course she had. Alexander closed his fist around the moonstone necklace until the chain bit into his skin. Prepare, riders. Mason did not move. Your Majesty, the treaty, prepare them. Mason bowed once, but his voice stayed low. If she reached Miller land, we cannot retrieve her by force. Alexander's gaze cut to him. Mason held it. Quietly. Firmly. And I do not think she left so she could be retrieved. The words struck harder than defiance. Alexander looked toward the darkening window, toward the west, toward the woman he had called useful because he had been too arrogant to call her irreplaceable. "Then I will ask," he said. But even as he spoke, the necklace lay cold in his hand, and some part of him already knew Grace Miller had not crossed that bridge to wait for permission to return. By nightfall, Alpha King Alexander Whitmore had riders on every road his crown could legally touch. The northern pass was searched twice. The river crossing was watched until the water turned black under the moon. Every inn before the neutral towns received his seal. Every stable boy, ferry keeper, and border patrol was questioned until fear made their answers shake. None of it brought Grace back. It only taught the kingdom how far a quiet woman could travel when no one had believed she was leaving. Alexander rode west with Mason beside him, the moonstone necklace wrapped around his fist beneath his glove. He had changed out of council black into riding clothes, but nothing made him feel less exposed. Not the guards behind him, not the royal banner snapping in the cold wind, not the authority that had once opened every gate before he reached it. The farther west they rode, the less useful his crown became. Whitmore land thinned into old treaty roads, then into forested hills marked by stone posts carved with the Miller crest. Grace's father's land, small compared to his kingdom, old compared to his reign, protected by agreements his grandfather had signed and Alexander had never cared to reread because Grace had always kept track of such things for him. That thought followed him like a punishment. Mason slowed first. Ahead, two riders waited beneath an arch of bare winter trees. No drawn weapons, no threat, only stillness. A woman in a dark riding coat lifted one hand. "You may go no farther under royal escort." Alexander did not stop until his horse stood several steps from hers. "I am here for Grace Miller." The woman's expression did not change. Lady Miller arrived before first light. Lady Miller, not Lady Grace of Whitmore Palace. Not the Alpha King's almost Luna. Not the woman who handled what others ignored. Her own name had reached this place before his regret did. Alexander's hand tightened around the reins. "I want to see her. She knows." The answer struck him strangely. Small, controlled, final. Mason shifted beside him, but said nothing. Alexander looked past the riders toward the road beyond. In the distance, through the trees, he could see the faint glow of a manor on the hill. Warm windows, smoke lifting from chimneys. A place awake, but not waiting for him. "Then tell her I am asking," Alexander said. The woman studied him for a moment. "She said you might." His wolf lifted sharply beneath his skin. Hope was cruel when it returned without permission. And the woman reached into her coat and withdrew a folded paper. Not a letter. Too small. Too plain. She offered it to Mason, not to Alexander. Mason took it carefully, then looked at his king before passing it over. Alexander unfolded it with fingers that did not feel steady. There were only 7 words, written in Grace's clean, precise hand. "If he wants reasons, remember his words." That was all. No dear Alexander. No accusation. No plea. No goodbye hidden inside politeness. Just a mirror held up to the one place he had refused to look. The cold moved through him slowly. Not from the wind. From understanding. He had thought reaching Miller Land would begin the conversation. He had imagined apologies, explanations, maybe anger. Anger would have been merciful. Anger could be answered. This could not. Grace had not left a door half open for him to push through with enough remorse. She had closed it before dawn and walked to a place where even his wolf had to stop at the border. Alexander lowered the paper. The woman's gaze moved briefly to his gloved hand. "She also asked that you keep whatever symbol you brought with you. She has no use for it here." The necklace burned cold beneath his glove. For one moment, he almost hated her for knowing him so well. Then the feeling collapsed under its own shame. Of course she knew. Grace had always known what he would carry, what he would say, what he would delay until too late. She had built years of survival around predicting a man who never bothered to understand her in return. Mason's voice came quietly beside him. "Your Majesty." Behind them, the royal riders waited. Beyond the arch, Millerland remained silent. Alexander looked once more at the manor on the hill. No figure appeared at the window. No curtain moved. No soft-hearted woman came down the road because he had finally decided her absence hurt him. Grace Miller had left Whitmore Palace without a goodbye. By sunrise, he had turned the kingdom upside down searching. By nightfall, he understood the search had never been the point. She was not hidden. She was not lost. She was not waiting to be convinced that useful could become loved if he said it desperately enough. Alexander folded the paper and held it against the necklace in his palm. Then, slowly, he turned his horse back toward the kingdom she had kept alive in silence. Behind him, the Miller border did not close dramatically. It did not need to. Grace had already done that herself. Whitmore Palace looked smaller when Alexander returned without her. Not to the eye. The towers still cut into the night sky. The gates still opened before his horse reached them. Guards still bowed. Servants still stepped aside. And the royal banner still moved above the entrance as if nothing essential had changed. But Alexander felt the difference before he dismounted. The palace no longer felt like power waiting to receive him. It felt like work left unfinished. Work Grace had once finished before anyone knew it was work. Mason rode behind him in silence. No one asked whether they had found her. They knew before he entered the courtyard. Men returned with victory differently. Alexander came back with mud on his boots, a folded note in his coat, and the moonstone necklace still hidden inside his glove like a wound he refused to show. Vanessa Clark waited at the top of the marble steps. Of course she did. She wore silver tonight, her hair pinned with pearl combs, her expression carefully softened for the moment she had imagined. Comfort, concern, perhaps even triumph, if she could disguise it well enough. Alexander, she said, descending one step. You should come inside. The council has been waiting. He looked at her. Once, Vanessa's beauty had seemed effortless to him. Bright, public, easy to place beneath chandeliers. Now, after standing at the border of Miller land and being refused by a woman who did not even come down to reject him in person, Vanessa's brightness felt painfully thin. Let them wait, he said. Her smile faltered. They have questions. So do I. The courtyard went still around them. Vanessa glanced at Mason, then at the servants pretending not to listen. Perhaps we should speak privately. Alexander almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because privacy had been where he hid everything that should have been honorable. Privacy had held Grace's necklace, Grace's promises, Grace's almost place beside him. Privacy had given him years to pretend delay was not denial. No, he said. Vanessa's fingers tightened against her skirt. No. Alexander removed the glove from his right hand. Slowly, the moonstone necklace slid into view, tangled against his palm. A few servants lowered their eyes. Mason did not. Vanessa stared at it with something close to irritation before she recovered. You brought that back? She would not take it. Then let it go. The words came too quickly, too sharp beneath the softness. Alexander looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not the woman he had chosen to display, but the woman who had benefited from Grace being hidden. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice. She left you. She embarrassed you. She abandoned the kingdom. Silence fell hard enough that even the horses quieted. Alexander's voice was low. Do not say that again. Vanessa paled. I only mean, she completed every report before she left. She marked every crisis. She prepared the kingdom to survive the morning without her. His hand closed around the necklace. We were the ones too incompetent to read what she left behind. No one moved. Not the guards. Not the servants. Not the council elders watching from the open doors above. Vanessa's eyes shone, but not with sorrow. And what does that make me? She whispered. Alexander looked past her toward the palace entrance, toward the halls Grace had walked in silence for years. That is not a question for me. He climbed the steps without taking her arm. Inside, the council chamber was full. Elders stood when he entered. Papers covered the table in disordered piles. Grace's absence sat among them more heavily than any person could have. Elder Voss began. Your Majesty, the Miller border refusal complicates. Enough. The room froze. Alexander placed Grace's note on the table. 7 words. Clean. Merciless. If he wants reasons, remember his words. No one touched it. No one had to. Shame moved through the room like smoke. Alexander looked at each elder slowly. Tell me what I said. Elder Voss lowered his gaze. Another man swallowed. No one answered. Cowards, Alexander thought. Then the truth struck him colder. He had been one of them. The worst of them. He had spoken the words because he believed no consequence would follow. I called her useful, he said. His own voice sounded foreign. Because she never asked for more. The confession landed with no drama. That made it uglier. Mason stood near the wall, face unreadable. Vanessa remained outside the chamber doors, silent now. Alexander set the necklace beside the note. Moonstone beside paper. Symbol beside truth. From tonight forward, he said, every duty Lady Grace Miller carried will be named. Every decision she made will be reviewed. Every debt this throne owes her will be recorded. Elder Voss looked up. And if she does not return? Alexander stared at the necklace. Cold. Beautiful. Empty. Then the record will still remain. For the first time all day, he did not say find her. He did not order riders. He did not turn grief into command. He only stood in the council chamber Grace had saved 100 times and understood that regret was not a bridge. It was only the place a man stood after burning one. Grace Miller did not hear about the council chamber confession until 3 days later. By then, Whitmore Palace had become a quieter thing in her mind. Not harmless. Not forgiven. Simply farther away. Miller House stood on a low hill beyond the treaty road, old stone wrapped in winter ivy, its windows facing the pine valley her father had once called stubborn land. Grace had forgotten how silence sounded when it did not require endurance. Here, silence did not wait for footsteps outside her door. It did not brace for council summons. It did not hold its breath around a king's mood. It settled gently over breakfast tables, library shelves, cold gardens, and the small study her aunt had reopened for her the morning she arrived. The first day, Grace slept. Not gracefully. Not briefly. She fell asleep in an armchair before the fire with her travel cloak still around her shoulders and woke near dusk beneath a quilt someone had placed over her without asking questions. The second day, she walked the boundary wall alone and watched Whitmore riders stop where the treaty stones began. They never crossed. That mattered more than she expected. The third day, Aunt Margaret entered the study with a sealed report from a Miller scout and a face too careful to be casual. News from Whitmore Palace, she said. Grace looked up from the old land ledgers. Her hand did not tremble. That felt like victory. Is he at the border again? No. Margaret placed the report on the desk. He has stopped searching. The words should have loosened something inside her. Instead, Grace felt only a quiet stillness. Good. Margaret studied her. He named your work before the council. Grace said nothing. All of it, from what I hear. Trade routes. Southern arbitration. Winter rations. Border seals. He ordered every duty you carried to be recorded under your name. The fire cracked softly. Grace looked down at the ledger before her. Her father's handwriting filled the margins, blunt and impatient. Do not trust crowns to remember what quiet people pay for. He had written that beside an old tax treaty years before Alexander ever placed a moonstone necklace at her throat. Grace almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because some lessons waited patiently for grief to catch up. That does not change what happened, she said. Margaret's expression softened. No, but it means they know. Grace closed the ledger. They always knew enough. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Honest. Margaret moved closer and touched the back of the chair, not Grace's shoulder. Everyone here seemed to understand the mercy of not claiming pieces of her too quickly. What do you want to do? Grace looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the Miller fields stretched gray beneath winter light. Small territory. Old debts. Independent roads. People who had known her as a child before she became useful to a king. I want to read every treaty my father signed, she said. I want to know which lands Whitmore Palace forgot we still own. I want the western grain stores counted before snow closes the road. Margaret's mouth curved. You have been home 3 days. Then I am late. For the first time since leaving the palace, Grace laughed. Softly, briefly. It startled them both. The sound did not belong to heartbreak. It belonged to return. That evening, a second message came. Not from Alexander. From Mason Reed. He had written only what duty allowed and friendship dared. The palace is functioning, but badly. Your absence is understood now. I hope Millerland is kind to you. Grace read it twice, then folded it carefully. She did not answer. Not because Mason had done wrong. Because every reply to Whitmore still felt like a thread, and she was not ready to tie even a harmless one. Before sleep, she stood before the mirror in her chamber. No moonstone necklace touched her throat. No royal colors dressed her body. She wore a plain cream nightgown and a green shawl Margaret had found in her mother's cedar chest. Grace lifted her chin and studied herself without searching for what Alexander had failed to see. Soft face, tired eyes, strong mouth. A woman who had left without goodbye and survived the silence after. Far away, perhaps Alexander was learning to regret her properly. But Grace was learning something better. She was learning that being missed was not the same as being loved, and being named too late was not the same as being free. The Winter Council review arrived 9 days after Grace returned to Millerland. It should have been handled by letters. That was what the treaty allowed. Written proposals, sealed objections, signatures carried by neutral riders between territories that trusted parchment more than pride. But Whitmore Palace sent a formal request anyway. Not a command, not an order wrapped in velvet. A request. Aunt Margaret read it aloud in the morning study while Grace stood beside the window, watching frost gather along the garden wall. Alpha King Alexander Whitmore asks permission to attend the Western Review in person to address unresolved matters concerning grain routes and treaty obligations. Margaret lowered the page. He used the correct title for you. Grace did not turn. Which one? Lady Grace Miller. The name settled into the room quietly. Hers. Clean of palace shadows. Clean of moonstone promises. Grace looked at the white fields beyond the glass. Somewhere across the treaty road, Alexander had finally learned how to ask before entering. That should have pleased her more. Instead, it felt like watching a locked door receive a polite knock after the house had already been abandoned. Does the review require him? She asked. Margaret's expression did not change. No, Grace nodded. Then he does not come. No anger followed the words. No triumph. Only boundary. That was how she knew it was real. Revenge wanted witnesses. Freedom wanted peace. She crossed to the desk and took a blank sheet of paper. For a moment, her fingers hovered above the ink. Not because she did not know what to write. Because once, every message to Alexander had been shaped around his mood. Soften this. Explain that. Make truth small enough for a king to accept without feeling accused. She had written entire years that way. Not anymore. Her reply was brief. Formal. Exact. Your presence is not required for the Western Review. All necessary matters may be addressed through appointed council representatives. Lady Grace Miller. She signed her name without shaking. Margaret sealed the letter herself. By afternoon, the neutral rider carried it east. Grace watched him disappear down the road, then returned to the study and opened the grain ledgers. Work remained. Real work. Her work. Not tasks hidden beneath another man's authority. Not invisible labor dressed as devotion. The western storehouses needed counting before deeper snow. 3 tenant families needed new roof beams. The north pasture fence had collapsed during the storm. Small problems, perhaps, compared to kingdoms and crowns. But they belonged to people who would feel the cost if no one noticed them in time. Grace noticed. She always had. The difference was that now, noticing did not make her smaller. Near dusk, Mason Reed arrived under neutral escort. Grace met him in the outer hall, not the private study. He bowed, but not deeply enough to pretend they were strangers. Lady Miller. Hearing him use the name made something soften in her chest. Captain Reed. He handed her a sealed packet. Council copies for the review. No personal message. Grace accepted it. From him. Mason's eyes flickered once. From the throne. That was answer enough. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Mason said quietly, "He received your refusal." Grace looked at him, and he read it twice, then dismissed the council for the day. No satisfaction came. Only a faint ache, old and distant, like cold weather in a healed bone. I did not write it to hurt him. Mason's voice softened. I know. Grace looked down at the seal in her hand. That is the part he may not understand. Mason hesitated. He is beginning to. She almost smiled. Beginning is not the same as changing. No, Mason said. It is not. Outside, snow began falling again, soft against the windows. Grace stepped back, giving him permission to leave without saying it. Mason bowed once more. Millerland suits you. This time, she did smile. Small. Real. I am learning how to suit myself. After he left, Grace carried the packet to her desk and broke the seal. The papers were organized properly. Every margin clear. Every supporting number attached. Someone had tried very hard to make the work understandable without her rescuing it. Alexander, perhaps. Or a council finally afraid of what happened when quiet women stopped translating chaos into order. Grace read until the candles burned low. When she finished, she marked the corrections in red, signed the final page, and closed the file. Beyond the window, the road to Whitmore vanished beneath snow. For years, that road had meant return. Tonight, it was only a road. Nothing more. Nothing waiting. Nothing owed. Spring reached Miller Land before Whitmore Palace did. It came quietly at first, in the thaw along the western fence, in the green tips pushing through the garden beds, in the softer light that entered Grace's study each morning and stayed longer than winter ever allowed. By then, Grace Miller no longer counted how many days had passed since she left without a goodbye. At first, she had known the number exactly. 3 days, 9 days, 1 month. Long enough for the ache to change shape. Long enough for silence to stop feeling like punishment. Long enough to learn the difference between being alone and being unwanted. Now, when she woke before dawn, it was not because she expected a summons from the palace. It was because the Miller fields needed early attention, because the western tenants preferred morning meetings, because she liked watching fog lift from the low valley while the house remained still. Her life had not become grand. That surprised her, perhaps, in the gentlest way. No crown waited. No dramatic victory was announced beneath chandeliers. No Alpha King knelt before a crowd begging forgiveness while she turned away beautifully. Real freedom was quieter. It looked like choosing her own chair at the council table. It looked like signing grain orders under her own name. It looked like walking through town and hearing people say, "Lady Miller," not because they wondered what Alexander would make of her, but because they knew what she had done for them. On the first clear morning of spring, a final package arrived from Whitmore Palace. No royal escort. No demanding seal. Only Captain Mason Reed on a tired horse, carrying a small wooden box wrapped in plain cloth. Grace met him at the front steps. "Captain, Lady Miller." His smile was brief, but warmer than before. He held out the box. From the throne. Grace did not take it immediately. A message? No letter. Mason paused. Only this. She accepted the box and opened it there beneath the pale sunlight. Inside lay the moonstone necklace. Cleaned. Repaired. Folded carefully over dark velvet. Grace stared at it for a long moment. The last time she had seen it, she had left it on a desk beside completed reports and a life she could no longer survive. Now it looked smaller. Beautiful still, but small. Beneath it rested a narrow silver plaque engraved with simple words. Lady Grace Miller, whose work held the kingdom when the kingdom failed to hold her. Grace read it once. Then again. Mason said quietly. He ordered it entered into the royal record. Grace closed the box. The old ache moved through her, but softly now. Like a door opening in a room she no longer lived in. Tell him the record is received. Mason inclined his head. Nothing else. Grace looked toward the fields beyond the road. Workers were repairing the early irrigation lines. Aunt Margaret stood near the garden wall speaking with 2 village women. Life, ordinary and waiting for no man's regret, continued around her. No, Grace said. Nothing else. Mason understood. He bowed and rode back before noon. Grace carried the box into her study, but she did not put the necklace around her throat. She placed it on a high shelf beside her father's old treaty books, not as a promise, not as a wound, but as evidence. A beautiful thing could still be a chain if it asked a woman to wait in silence. That evening, Grace walked alone to the western bridge. The same bridge she had crossed before sunrise with wet shoes, a travel bag, and no goodbye. Spring water ran beneath it now, bright with thaw. She stood there until the sky turned gold. Somewhere far east, Alexander Whitmore still ruled a kingdom that had learned her name too late. Perhaps he regretted her properly now. Perhaps he held counsel differently. Perhaps he never again called a woman useful when he meant irreplaceable. Grace hoped so. Not for herself. For whoever stood beside him next. Then she turned away from the bridge and walked home. No one stopped her. No one called her back. No one arrived too late with a reason she no longer needed. The road behind her remained open, but it no longer pulled. Ahead, Miller House glowed warmly against the hill, every window lit, every room belonging to a life she had chosen. Grace stepped toward it calmly, not lost, not waiting, not useful enough to be kept and unseen, free enough to be missed and still never return.